My wife texted me saying, "I'm not your property. I'll be late, don't call." I looked at that screen for a full minute before I replied, "I'm not your husband anymore. Don't come back." 10 minutes later, my phone blew up with 24 missed calls. Welcome back to Inspiration Seeker. Today's story is a roller coaster about boundaries, self-respect, and the exact moment a marriage hits the point of no return. Trust me, you do not want to miss how this unfolds. If you enjoy stories about karma and standing your ground, do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment saying, "Respect," down below to support the channel. Now, let's get into the story. To really understand why I blew up my marriage with a single text message, you have to see the picture of my life before that night. On paper, I was living the absolute American dream. I'm Ethan, an architect, and I live in a beautiful 2-story house in the quiet suburbs just outside of Chicago. We have the manicured lawn, the 2-car garage, and the kind of neighborhood where people actually wave to each other. But inside those walls, it was freezing. And I'm not talking about the harsh Chicago winter. I'm talking about the absolute silence between me and my wife, Sarah. We've been married for 5 years, and for the first 4.5, things were incredible. But everything shifted exactly 6 months ago when Sarah landed a massive promotion at her PR firm downtown. We celebrated with champagne, thinking it was the start of a better future. Instead, it was the beginning of the end. Her new role came with a significant salary bump, sure, but it also came with a new crowd, a group of high-maintenance socialite friends who seemed to think marriage was just an inconvenient accessory to their single lifestyles. Slowly, the Sarah I fell in love with began to fade away. It started with small, subtle things. She stopped asking about my day. Then, she became glued to her phone. She used to leave it on the kitchen counter while cooking. Suddenly, it was always in her pocket or face down on the table. If I walked into the room while she was texting, she'd quickly angle the screen away. When I asked her who she was talking to, she'd roll her eyes and say I was being paranoid or suffocating. I found myself walking on eggshells in my own home. I was paying the mortgage, handling the utilities, and keeping the house running, while she treated the place like a hotel. She'd come home late, barely acknowledge my existence, and go straight to bed. I didn't feel like a husband anymore. I felt like a roommate who was just there to subsidize her lifestyle. I missed the connection we used to have, but every time I tried to bridge the gap, she pushed me away with cold indifference. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, just the stress of the new job. But deep down, I knew the foundation was cracking. The wedge between us really started to drive deep with the introduction of a new weekly ritual, the infamous girls' night out. In the beginning, I didn't mind it at all. In fact, I encouraged it. With how hard she was working, I thought blowing off some steam with her colleagues was exactly what she needed. It started innocently enough, a couple of margaritas and some appetizers at a local spot, home by 10 or 11. I was happy she was making friends. But looking back, I was naive. Within a month, the pattern shifted aggressively. Friday nights became strictly off-limits for me. It wasn't just dinner anymore. It was clubbing in the city with her new clique of single and recently divorced friends who seemed hell-bent on dragging Sarah down to their level. The curfew vanished. 11 o'clock turned into 1 in the morning. 1 turned into 3. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of her stumbling through the front door, giggling loudly on the phone, or knocking over things in the hallway, reeking of tequila and expensive perfume. When I tried to bring this up, I wasn't met with understanding or an apology. I was met with hostility. I remember one Saturday morning specifically. I sat her down with coffee, trying to keep things calm. I told her that I was worried about her safety coming home that late and that it felt disrespectful to our marriage to be out partying like a college student every single week. I wasn't telling her she couldn't go out. I was just asking for some moderation. Her reaction was immediate and explosive. She flipped the script completely. She told me I was being insecure and controlling. She said, "I work my tail off all week, Ethan. I deserve to have fun without my husband breathing down my neck." She made me feel like the villain for wanting my wife to come home at a reasonable hour. She weaponized modern buzzwords, calling my concern toxic and claiming I was trying to isolate her. It was masterclass manipulation. I started to doubt myself, wondering if maybe I really was being too uptight. I backed down, and that was my mistake. Because by backing down, I gave her the green light to push the boundaries even further. That brings us to this past Friday. If you know anything about Midwest winters, you know they don't mess around. The weather forecast had been warning us all week, and sure enough, by evening, Chicago was getting hammered. We were under a severe winter storm warning, with whiteout conditions and black ice coating the roads. Sarah had left earlier that evening, dressed to the nines in a short skirt and heels that were definitely not made for this weather, promising she'd be careful. But as the clock ticked past midnight, the snow turned into a full-blown blizzard. I was sitting in the living room, the TV volume low, watching the local news reports of pileups on the interstate. My anxiety started spiking. By 1 a.m., the roads were treacherous. At this point, I wasn't even mad about the time or the partying. I was genuinely scared for her physical safety. I picked up my phone and dialed her number, just wanting to hear that she was in an Uber or staying at a friend's place. It rang and rang, echoing in my ear, before going straight to voicemail. I waited 10 minutes and tried again. Nothing. Just radio silence. That familiar knot formed in my stomach, the one that sits right between worry and suspicion. Why wasn't she answering? Even if it was loud, she always checked her phone. I needed to know where she was, so I grabbed the household iPad. We have a joint credit card that we use for groceries and bills, but she keeps it in her wallet as a backup. I logged into our banking app, praying to see a charge from a local diner or a gas station, something that indicated she was safe or on her way home. Instead, my heart sank into the floor. There was a pending transaction timestamped just 20 minutes ago, $450 at the Onyx Room. I know that place. It's an ultra-exclusive hotel bar downtown, famous for overpriced cocktails and a clientele that is definitely looking for trouble. That is not a place you go for a casual drink with the girls. You don't drop nearly $500 on appetizers. That was a statement. The concern I felt for her safety evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, hard realization that while I was pacing the floor worrying about her dying in a snowstorm, she was living it up, completely disregarding me. I stared at that iPad screen until the pixels seemed to burn into my retinas. The Onyx Room. $450. That wasn't just a bar tab, that was a breach of contract. A part of me, the angry part, wanted to storm downtown, march into that hotel bar, and drag her out myself. But the logical part of me, the part that was exhausted from months of gaslighting and emotional roller coasters, knew better. If I showed up there, she would paint me as the crazy, stalking husband. She would make a scene, her friends would sneer, and I would lose whatever high ground I had left. I had to play this cool, even though my blood was absolutely boiling. I put the iPad down and picked up my phone. My hands were actually shaking a little, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of pure frustration. I decided to send one last lifeline. I was going to give her the benefit of the doubt one final time, despite the evidence staring me in the face. Maybe there was a rational explanation. Maybe she was treating everyone because it was someone's birthday. Maybe they were stuck there because of the snow. I needed to be the rational one. I needed to be the adult in the room. I typed out a message. I kept it simple, devoid of the anger I was feeling. I didn't mention the money. I didn't mention the club. I just wrote, "Hey, the roads are dangerously slick out there. I'm getting worried. Where are you exactly? When do you think you're coming home?" I hit send. And then, I waited. The silence in the house was deafening. Outside, the wind was howling against the siding, rattling the window panes, but inside, it was dead quiet. I sat on the edge of the sofa, staring at the three little dots that indicate a message is being typed, but they never appeared. The status just switched to delivered. Minutes ticked by like hours. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. I poured myself a glass of water just to have something to do with my hands. I was pacing the living room rug, wearing a path into the fabric. I told myself that if she didn't reply in 5 more minutes, I was done. Then, at the 15-minute mark, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I lunged for it, expecting an apology or an ETA. I was not prepared for what I was about to read. I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. I unlocked it, and there it was, a single gray bubble that would change the trajectory of my entire life. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an explanation. It was a declaration of war. The text read, "Stop acting like you own me. I'm not your property. I'll be late, don't call." I read it once. Then I read it again. I think I stared at those words for a full 60 seconds, trying to make sense of the aggression behind them. Here I was, sitting in our home, worried sick that my wife might be skidding off an icy bridge into a ditch, and her response was to treat me like an overbearing jailer. It was such a visceral slap in the face. It wasn't just the words, it was the timing. It was the complete lack of empathy. It was the audacity to take my genuine concern for her safety and twist it into an accusation of control. Something inside my chest didn't just break, it shattered. For months, I had been making excuses for her. Oh, she's stressed. Oh, she's just venting. Oh, she doesn't mean it. But reading that text, in the stark light of my living room at 1:15 in the morning, the blinders finally came off. This wasn't stress. This wasn't a phase. This was who she had become. She viewed our marriage not as a partnership, but as a cage. She viewed me not as her husband, but as an obstacle to her fun. The "I'm not your property" line echoed in my head. It was so defensive, so calculated. It was a line she probably rehearsed with her friends over expensive vodka tonics, high-fiving each other for standing up to the patriarchy, while I was at home making sure the pipes didn't freeze. That text was the straw that broke the camel's back. It stripped away every ounce of patience I had left. I realized right then that I wasn't dealing with a partner who was struggling. I was dealing with a narcissist who didn't respect me. And just like that, the anxiety vanished. I sat back on the plush couch, letting the phone drop to the cushion beside me. You know, people always talk about seeing red when they get angry. They talk about heat and screaming and throwing things against the wall. But in that moment, sitting in the dim glow of the fireplace while the snow piled up against the windows, I didn't feel any of that. Instead, I felt the temperature in my soul drop to absolute zero. It was a cold, clinical clarity that washed over me, sharper than any knife. I looked around the living room, at the framed wedding photos on the mantel, the renovations I had done with my own hands, the life we had built. And for the first time in 6 months, I didn't see a marriage worth saving. I saw a sunk cost. I realized I had been fighting for a corpse. The marriage I was mourning? It had been dead for a long time. I was just the only one showing up to the funeral every day, trying to perform CPR on a ghost. Sarah didn't want a husband, she wanted a safety net. She wanted the freedom of a single life with the financial security and stability of a married one. She wanted to run wild at the Onyx Room and then come back to a warm house and a clean bed without consequences. And by staying silent, by being the bigger man, I had been enabling her. I had been teaching her that she could treat me like garbage and I would still be there to take out the trash in the morning. That realization snapped everything into place. The sadness evaporated. The longing for her to return to her old self vanished. I wasn't heartbroken anymore. I was indifferent. And let me tell you, indifference is far more dangerous than anger. Anger means you still care. Anger means you're still invested. Indifference means you're done. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured the rest of my water down the sink. I felt lighter. I wasn't confused about what to do next. The path was crystal clear. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to beg. I just needed to close the book. I picked up the phone again. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady as a surgeon's about to make the first incision. I looked at her message one last time, "I'm not your property," and I decided to give her exactly what she asked for. She wanted autonomy. She wanted to be free from my ownership. Fine. But freedom comes with a price tag, and she was about to find out that the price was her comfortable life in this house. I didn't need to draft the message. I didn't need to second-guess the wording. I knew exactly what needed to be said to sever the tie completely. I typed it out, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction with every letter. If that's the case, I'm not your husband anymore. Don't bother coming home. Short. Brutal. Final. I stared at the blinking cursor for a split second, taking a deep breath. This wasn't a bluff. This wasn't a tactic to get her to chase me. This was an eviction notice for her place in my heart and my home. I pressed the blue arrow to send. Whoosh. The bubble rose up the screen, sitting right underneath her toxic declaration. I didn't lock the phone. I held it, watching the screen like a hawk. For someone who claimed she was busy and late, the response was instantaneous. The status changed from delivered to read in less than 10 seconds. She was staring right at her phone. She saw it. I imagined the music in the club fading into the background as she read those words. I imagined the color draining from her face. She thought she held all the cards. She thought she could dangle her affection and her presence over my head like a prize I had to beg for. But I had just flipped the table. I placed the phone face down on the table, not out of anger, but because I had work to do. The digital bridge was burned. Now, I had to secure the physical perimeter. The moment that text message status switched to read, I was already moving. I didn't sit there wringing my hands or wondering if I was being too harsh. I felt a surge of energy, a need to make my physical reality match the digital one I had just created. I walked to the heavy oak front door and threw the deadbolt. Click. That sound was the most satisfying thing I'd heard all year. It was the sound of a boundary finally being set in stone. I didn't stop there. I walked over to the security panel on the wall. We usually only arm the system when we go on vacation or if we're both out of town for the weekend. But tonight, I punched in the code and set it to stay mode, which arms all the perimeter sensors, doors, and windows instantly. If that door opened, the sirens would wake up the entire neighborhood. I was securing the fortress. Next, I marched upstairs to the master bedroom. I pulled her large Samsonite suitcase from the top shelf of the closet. I didn't have time to be neat, and frankly, I didn't care. I opened her drawers and started grabbing armfuls of essentials. Underwear, socks, jeans, sweatpants. I went into the bathroom and swept her entire array of expensive creams, makeup, and hair products into a travel bag. I wasn't destroying her property. I'm not a monster, and I wasn't going to give her any legal ammunition against me, but I wasn't folding her laundry either. This was an eviction, not a vacation. I zipped the suitcase shut. It was bulging at the seams. I dragged it back downstairs, the wheels thumping against each step like a heartbeat. I opened the front door just wide enough to shove the suitcase out onto the covered porch. The wind whipped snow into the foyer for a brief second before I slammed the door shut again and relocked the deadbolt. I looked through the peephole at her bag sitting there in the freezing cold. It looked lonely. It looked out of place. And for the first time in a long time, the house felt completely, wonderfully mine. I walked back into the living room and poured myself a glass of scotch. Neat. My hands were steady, my breathing was even. The silence in the house was heavy, but it was a peaceful kind of heavy. That silence, however, didn't last long. About 10 minutes after I sent that text, my phone on the coffee table woke up. Buzz. The screen lit up. I glanced at it. Incoming call. The caller ID said, wife. I didn't reach for it. I just took a sip of my drink and watched it vibrate against the wood. It rang until it went to voicemail. Buzz. Immediately, it started again. Second call. I picked up the phone, but not to answer. I went into my contacts, hit edit, and deleted the word wife. I typed in Sarah. It was a small bit of administrative work, but it felt significant. I wasn't just changing a contact name, I was reclassifying her role in my life. I set the phone back down. Then came the flood. The phone didn't just ring, it convulsed. It was a constant, rhythmic buzzing that echoed through the room. 3 calls. 5 calls. 10 calls. It was relentless. Between the calls, the text messages started piling up on the lock screen like a digital car crash. At first, they were furious. "What the hell is wrong with you? Are you serious right now? You can't just say that." Then, as the calls went unanswered, the tone shifted. The bravado from her, "I'm not your property," text evaporated completely. The messages became frantic. "Ethan, pick up the phone. I'm leaving the club now. Stop joking, this isn't funny." I watched the counter on the screen climb. 15 missed calls. 20 missed calls. By the time it finally stopped for a brief second, the notification bubble sat at a staggering 24 missed calls. It was pathetic, really. The same woman who, 20 minutes ago, was too independent to be bothered with my existence, was now blowing up my phone like a desperate teenager. She had realized that the property she despised, the stability, the home, the husband, was slipping through her fingers, and she was scrambling to grab hold of it before it was gone. But I just sat there, swirling the amber liquid in my glass, watching the battery drain. About 40 minutes after the phone finally stopped buzzing, I saw the sweep of headlights cut through the darkness of the living room window. A car idled at the curb, a rideshare, likely an Uber XL given the size. I didn't move from my spot on the couch. I just pulled up the app for our front door security camera on my phone. The feed loaded in crisp 1080p, showing the snow swirling violently under the porch light. I watched the rear door of the car open. Sarah stepped out. Even through the grainy night vision, I could see she was shivering. She was wearing a strapless cocktail dress and a thin leather jacket that was purely for fashion, completely useless against a Chicago blizzard. She slammed the car door and ran up the walkway, head down against the wind, expecting to burst through the front door and start the fight she had been rehearsing in her head during the ride home. But she stopped dead in her tracks when she hit the porch. There it was, her Samsonite suitcase, dusted with a light layer of fresh snow, sitting like a monolith in front of the door. I watched on the screen as she stared at it for a second, confusion written all over her face. Then, the realization hit her. She lunged for the door handle and yanked it. It didn't budge. The deadbolt held firm. She tried again, harder this time, rattling the heavy wood against the frame. When that didn't work, she started pounding. Thud, thud, thud. The sound vibrated through the house, but I felt like I was watching a movie. On my phone screen, I saw her mouthing my name, screaming into the wood. She pressed her face against the frosted glass sidelight, trying to see inside. "Ethan, open the damn door. It's freezing." Her voice was muffled by the wind and the thick insulation of the house, but the panic in her tone was crystal clear. She started ringing the doorbell, over and over again, a manic chime echoing through the hallway. I simply reached over to the wall panel and muted the indoor chime. Silence returned to the living room, save for the dull thuds from outside. I took another slow sip of my scotch. I wasn't being cruel. I was just holding the boundary. She had told me not to call, implying she didn't need me. She had told me she wasn't my property, implying she didn't belong here. I was simply respecting her wishes. The woman on the porch wasn't my wife. She was a stranger who had told me to get lost. And we don't open the door for strangers in the middle of the night. When the pounding on the door finally stopped, I didn't for a second think she had given up. I knew Sarah. When she couldn't bully her way through a situation, she escalated it. She went nuclear. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, the soft glow of the streetlights was replaced by the harsh, strobing blue and red lights of a squad car painting my living room walls. She had played the ultimate victim card. She had called 911. I watched on the monitor as she ran down the driveway to meet the officers, flailing her arms, pointing back at the house, playing the part of the distressed damsel perfectly. She was telling them I had illegally evicted her, that I was endangering her life in a blizzard. It was a serious accusation, but I was ready for it. I put my glass down, took a deep breath, and walked to the front door. I opened it before the officers could even knock, stepping out onto the porch but keeping the storm door closed behind me to keep the heat in. Sarah was standing behind a tall, seasoned-looking officer, sobbing hysterically. "That's him!" she shrieked, her voice slurring. "He locked me out. Arrest him." I looked the officer dead in the eye. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get emotional. I was the picture of calm, rational stability. "Officer," I said, my voice steady over the wind. "I haven't evicted anyone. As you can see, I packed her belongings for her. But tonight, my wife is intoxicated, she has been verbally abusive, and she is behaving aggressively. I do not feel safe letting her into this house right now. I am simply removing myself from a volatile situation." The cop looked at Sarah. She was swaying in her heels, mascara running down her cheeks, shivering violently, and smelling like a distillery. Then he looked at me, sober, calm, and standing in the doorway of a house that was solely in my name before the marriage. He sighed the sigh of a man who hates domestic disputes. He turned to Sarah. "Ma'am, look. This is a civil matter regarding the property. But if he feels threatened and you're in this state, I can't force him to unlock that door tonight. You need to go somewhere else to cool off." Her jaw dropped. She tried to argue, screaming that it was her house too, but the officers weren't having it. They could see clearly who was the aggressor here. They told her she could either call a friend or they could drive her to a local motel, but she wasn't getting back inside tonight. Defeated and freezing, she finally slumped. I watched as she furiously typed on her phone, likely summoning another Uber, while the police waited to ensure she left the property. She screamed one last obscenity at me as she dragged her suitcase down the driveway. I didn't respond. I just nodded to the officer, stepped back inside, and threw the deadbolt for the last time. The sun rose over Chicago the next morning, blindingly bright, reflecting off 2 feet of fresh, pristine snow. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside silent and still. Inside, I felt exactly the same way. I woke up on the couch, not because I had passed out, but because I didn't want to sleep in the bed we used to share. For the first time in months, I had slept deeply, without the knot of anxiety in my chest wondering when, or if, she would come home. I sat up and reached for my phone. It had been on Do Not Disturb since the police left. When I unlocked the screen, the floodgates opened. It was a digital massacre. There were 47 unread text messages and 12 voicemails. I scrolled through them, watching Sarah go through the 5 stages of grief in real time within my inbox. At 3 a.m., it was anger. "You're going to pay for this." At 4 a.m., it was bargaining. "Can we please just talk? I'm at the Motel 6 off the highway. It's disgusting. Please let me come home." At 6 a.m., it was depression. "I'm sorry. I messed up. I love you. Please don't do this." I didn't listen to a single voicemail. I didn't read the long, rambling paragraphs where she tried to justify her behavior or blame her friends. It was just noise. The emotional tether that had bound me to her for 5 years was completely severed. I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was reading about a stranger's drama. I walked into the kitchen and brewed a pot of coffee. While the machine gurgled, I made one phone call. It wasn't to Sarah. It was to a shark of a divorce attorney in downtown Chicago who I had heard about from a colleague. I left a message with his intake service. "My name is Ethan. I have a house, no kids, and a wife who abandoned the marriage. I want to file on Monday." I poured the coffee into my favorite mug and stood by the window, looking out at the empty driveway where her car used to be. The text I sent the night before wasn't a bluff. It wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a statement of fact. When I typed, "I'm not your husband anymore," I meant it. Sipping that coffee, in the quiet of my own home, I realized it was the best cup I had ever tasted. I wasn't lonely. I was free. It's been exactly 6 months since the blizzard. The divorce was finalized last week. Because the house was purchased in my name prior to the marriage and we had no children, The proceedings were cleaner than Sarah expected, though she certainly tried to fight for every appliance and piece of furniture. She's currently living in a studio apartment on the other side of town, a far cry from the suburban comfort she used to take for granted. From what mutual friends tell me, the girls' night crew didn't stick around long once she stopped having the disposable income to keep up with them. It turns out, those friendships were just as shallow as her loyalty to our marriage. As for me, I kept the house. I've started renovating the master bedroom, stripping the wallpaper, painting the walls a new color, buying new furniture. I needed to erase the ghost of the marriage from the space. Sometimes, I look at my phone and think about that text message. It was the hardest thing I ever had to type, but it saved my life. It taught me that self-respect isn't something you can negotiate. You either have it, or you don't. Sarah thought she could treat me like an option while demanding the privileges of a priority. She learned the hard way that when you tell someone they don't own you, you also lose the protection of their care. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just moving forward, one peaceful day at a time. And that is the story of how one disrespectful text message ended a 5-year marriage. Now, I want to turn this over to you guys. Did Ethan go too far by locking her out in a blizzard, or was it the necessary wake-up call for a toxic partner? If you were in his shoes, would you have opened that door, or would you have done exactly what he did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life dramas about justice and karma, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Smash that like button if you think Ethan made the right call. Thanks for watching, Inspiration Seeker. Remember, respect is a two-way street. If they close it off, it's time to find a new road. See you in the next video.